You might have actually seen the new Netflix series that recently dropped about this, but today in this explainer, we're going to dig deep into the definitive evidence, the massive forensic undertaking, and the decades-long pursuit of justice surrounding Pan Am Flight 103. We're talking about a story that goes from a shattered aircraft falling from a winter sky all the way down to a microscopic piece of evidence that literally changed international law. It's really one of the most complex puzzles in modern history. Okay, so let's just jump right in. To even begin to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the investigation that followed this tragedy, you really just have to look at one specific directive. It came from John Boyd, the chief constable of the local Scottish police. He told his officers, unless it's growing there, I want you to go out, pick it up, document it as evidence, and bring it back in. That single, meticulous order, it launched what would become the largest criminal inquiry in British history. And to understand the long road ahead for those investigators, we've got to look at the timeline. The tragedy itself struck in 1988, right? But it would take until 1991 for the first indictments, 2001 for a verdict, and astonishingly, all the way to 2022 for a new arrest. So we are looking at a 34-year legal and forensic marathon here. Let's start with the hard facts of that terrible night. At 6:25 p.m. on December 21st, 1988, a Boeing 747 known as Clipper Made of the Seas leaves London for New York. It hits a cruising altitude of 31,000 feet. But then, at exactly 7:03 p.m., an explosion tears a 13 by 23-inch hole right in the forward cargo hold. This all happens in less than 1 second. The crew had absolutely zero time to even send a mayday call before the aircraft split mid-air and plummeted to the ground in 6 major sections. The result of that sudden, catastrophic failure is really summed up by one single, solemn number: 270. Behind that statistic is just a devastating human reality. 259 individuals on board lost their lives. That included citizens from 21 different countries, and 190 of them were Americans. Tragically, this also included 35 study abroad students from Syracuse University. But the devastation didn't end in the air. 11 residents in the quiet Scottish town of Lockerbie were killed on the ground as the blazing wreckage just rained down on their homes. To comprehend the monumental task investigators were now facing, you have to picture the geography of the aftermath. Gale force winds scattered the debris and the victims across an 845-square-mile corridor of really rugged Scottish terrain. In Lockerbie itself, specifically on a street called Sherwood Crescent, the impact of the plane's wing box, which was loaded with 200,000 pounds of aviation fuel, created a massive crater. We're talking 140 feet long and 40 feet deep. The heat was so incredibly intense, it literally melted wrought iron gates like they were butter. So how do you even manage this unprecedented mountain of physical evidence spread across an entire region? Well, investigators deployed a pretty groundbreaking tool for the time: the British Holmes computer system. You can think of it as the digital nervous system of the whole investigation. Every single fragment out of the more than 10,000 pieces of human remains, aircraft components, and cargo that they recovered had to be rigorously analyzed, x-rayed, scanned for explosive residue, and then painstakingly logged into this database. And the logistical stats feeding into that database were truly staggering. The effort required over 1,000 police officers and 600 soldiers. They logged over 16,000 specific evidence items and took upwards of 35,000 photographs. Astonishingly, to put it into perspective, investigators covered an estimated 1.5 million vehicle miles, driving all across Scotland just to recover the remnants of the aircraft. But all this data allowed forensic experts to pull off the impossible. Inside a military hangar, they actually recovered and reassembled over 80% of the Boeing 747. By analyzing the blast damage on that reconstructed fuselage, they pinpointed the exact origin of the explosion. They traced it back to a Toshiba radio cassette player hidden inside a brown Samsonite suitcase. And they even figured out that the suitcase was loaded into the plane's lower left front section, specifically inside a cargo container labeled AV4041. But here's the thing. The macro crime scene is really only half the story. Months after the initial recovery, Scottish police found a badly scorched shirt. And when they looked a bit closer, they made a massive discovery. Embedded into the folded polyester fabric, fused there by the intense heat of the explosion, was a microscopic circuit board fragment. It was literally a needle in a haystack. And that led to the true breakthrough. Scottish investigators passed this tiny fragment to the FBI, who then routed it over to the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology. Electronics experts there definitively matched this tiny, charred piece of evidence to a very specific timer, the MEBO MST-13. Now, why does that matter? Because only 20 of these timers were ever manufactured in history, and they were made exclusively for Libyan intelligence services. For the investigators, this was the absolute smoking gun. Of course, this definitive evidence immediately triggered a massive geopolitical standoff. In 1991, 2 Libyan intelligence officers were formally indicted on charges of murder. But for the next 8 years, Libya just refused to extradite the suspects. This created a painful, decade-long stalemate for the families of those 270 victims, who were left waiting in agony while the United Nations imposed heavy sanctions on Libya. So to break this diplomatic stalemate, the justice system really had to adapt. In 1999, a completely unique legal compromise was brokered. A special Scottish court was set up at Camp Van Zeist in the Netherlands, so it was a neutral third country, but it strictly operated under Scottish law. It also featured some incredible judicial innovation for its time. They actually set up closed-circuit television extensions to allow victims' families in London, New York, and Washington to view the proceedings in real time. Finally, in January 2001, after 12 agonizing years of waiting, the verdict arrived. And honestly, it was deeply mixed. One operative, Abdel Basset al-Magrahi, was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison, but his co-defendant, Alamin Khalifa Fima, was acquitted and returned to freedom in Libya. The town of Lockerbie and the families of the victims tried to find some degree of closure, but a lot of people felt that state-sponsored terrorism extended far beyond just the one convicted man. And what happens to those families after the gavel falls? The lasting human toll of this tragedy extended way, way beyond the courtroom. According to surveys conducted by the National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center around the time of the trial, the psychological scars ran deep. 72% of families reported great difficulty coping. 54% missed work due to distress or just the sheer demands of following the investigation. And even 12 years later, 37% were still suffering from weekly sleep difficulties. That relentless pursuit of answers put a massive strain on both their physical and financial health. But despite this immense trauma, the legacy of Pan Am 103 is one of continuous remembrance and a pretty unending pursuit of justice. Back in 1989, Syracuse University established 35 remembrance scholarships, honoring the students lost by educating a generation born long after the disaster. During the trial in 2000, the Office for Victims of Crime stepped up with unprecedented support, setting a completely new standard for how we treat victims of mass violence. And incredibly, in December 2022, almost 34 years to the day after the bombing, the U.S. Department of Justice actually announced the arrest and indictment of a third suspect, the alleged maker of the explosive device. Which brings us to a final lingering thought for this explainer. We've seen an investigation span 34 years, cross global jurisdictions, hinge on microscopic evidence, and push the very boundaries of international law. Today, this case is re-entering the global spotlight, especially with that newly released Netflix series exploring the tragedy that I mentioned earlier. But looking at the unimaginable resilience of these families who fought for decades, we really have to ask, even as new suspects are brought to trial, will the final chapter of Pan Am Flight 103 ever truly be closed?